In this session, we are going to talk about a very important sector called as the power sector. So the power and electricity forms a core part of the Indian economy development altogether. But apart from that, we want to explore electricity through the non-commercial factors at a higher level. We don't want to pollute the environment saying that we want to grow our GDP. Good morning and welcome to the session 4 of chapter 8 on infrastructure. We have been speaking about the various factors of infrastructure, including on the energy part. In this session, we are going to talk about a very important sector called as the power sector. Now, the word power and electricity is quite known in India. That's almost the lifeline for any industry or for any household to survive. And India has been one country which has been striving very hard to make the power sector regulation and make electricity available 24/7 to all the places, to all villages, all districts in India. So in this session, let us try to focus upon the power sector and try to analyze the various factors that are involved in it. Now, moving forward, the first thing, we are going to look into power and electricity, and the second thing, we are going to look what are the challenges that are remaining in this sector. In fact, if you look into the constitution, that is our ministry, power alone has got a separate ministry just like coal. That is the importance that has been given to the power sector altogether. We also have a regulatory committee called as the CERC, the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. So this is quite an interesting sector, an intensifying sector which is trying to develop the economy at a very large. But of course, yes, what are the challenges and how we are going to overcome it? That's what we are going to look in this chapter. So quickly moving forward, let's try to understand the power sector altogether. Now, the most visible form of energy which is often identified in the modern civilization is power and commonly known as electricity. This is one word that we have been learning right from our childhood. This is one area where we have spent most of our time trying to ask this question, why power cuts? Why suddenly power goes off? Why don't we have 100% power backup? When will the time be there where we can get continuous flow of electricity? Why? Because the section and the areas itself are so interesting to talk about. Right from the day when electricity was invented and it was given as a source of energy to the mankind altogether, we always understood and relied that this particular energy will never go down and will be always available with us 100% of the time. But unfortunately, what happens in a country like India, where we have electricity almost to 85% to 90%, we still struggle in terms of getting onto that 100% because there are still some villages, some rural areas in India which have not yet got this electricity connection completely done. But then the most important thing is that this is the critical component of infrastructure that determines the economic development. So the power and electricity forms a core part of the Indian economy development altogether. So when we are going to talk about development in India, power sector is an inbuilt fraction of it altogether. Next thing, the growth rate of demand for power is generally higher than the GDP rate itself. Now look at the fantastic factor here. The growth rate of power, that means power sometimes grows at that speed, at that continuous fraction, that it's even more than the GDP. That means the demand, the consumption factor in this particular sector is so high that people are interested in again and again looking into this sector. So this is going to be an everlasting sector altogether. Studies point out that in order to have 8% GDP growth per annum, the power supply needs to grow around 12% annually. Now, quite a simple relation, but yet a powerful one. Why? Because if the GDP has to increase to 8% and above, power has to go up by 12. Then only manufacturing will go up. Industrial development will go up, because all of these industries are directly dependent on the power supply. So higher the power supply, the uninterrupted power supply, which is available with backup, then automatically what happens? Manufacturing also starts picking up in the country. Everybody will start producing more and more. Exports will go up, which in turn will help the GDP again come back to 8.5% and above. So this is the connection that power has got towards the economy in all sector. Now, moving forward, electricity as a functionary, as a secondary form of energy produced by the primary sources. Now, what are the primary sources? Coal, hydrocarbon, hydro energy that we are talking about, nuclear energy, and the renewable energy. Now, in India, we are primarily dependent on coal. Coal is one of the major raw materials or the input from which electricity is produced. Again, coal being a scarce resource in our country. If you start using too much of coal, automatically electricity production will come down at one point of time. So what is essential, or what is very, very important for us here to know that we are trying to work with the renewable energy formats like solar or wind power or tidal, so that even that can be used in the power generation process. One of the new areas which I would like to talk about is the nuclear energy that we are trying to harness in India. But of course, scientists and experts believe that nuclear energy can have some fearing consequences on the people, on the mankind, or on the location. So that's one of the reasons where we have not expanded too much on the nuclear energy side. But apart from that, we want to explore electricity through the non-commercial factors at a higher level. Now, the primary energy consumption takes into account the direct and indirect consumption of fuel. So it is quite obvious. The primary energy consumption itself will take into account the direct and indirect consumption. So automatically it consumes, automatically it takes in. It cannot give a complete picture in respect to ultimate consumption of energy by consumers. So that is one thing that we have to pinpoint, that we need to understand here. It cannot give in that ultimate factor. The secondary sources in India consist of oil, coal, electricity, and natural gas. So India is dependent on power sector. India is dependent on the primary sources consist of these factors. They are highly needed for the economic development. So whenever we talk about electricity, whenever we talk about the power sector, this is going to be a key focus for us when it comes to the overall economic development. Moving forward. Now in India, way back to an old statistics, 2003 and 4, thermal sources accounted for almost 70% of power generation capacity in India. So primarily we dependent on the thermal energy source in order to produce electricity. Apart from that, the hydro, wind, nuclear sources also accounted for 28% and 2.4% respectively. So you can look here that nuclear energy is the last source that we have dependent upon. Only 2.4% has been extracted from there because of the factors that are involved in that. So India's energy policy encourages two energy sources. One is the hydel and the second one is the wind energy. Since they do not rely on fossil fuel and they avoid carbon emissions. Now, this is what we are going to talk about in this session. We don't want to pollute the environment saying that we want to grow our GDP. We don't want our environment to get disturbed by any kind of production. So we want to keep the environment on a green print, on a clear footprint, and then we want to go on the non-commercial sources like the hydel and that of the wind, so that we are able to produce electricity at much cheaper rate and also faster and accessible. So this has resulted in the faster growth of electricity production from these two sources, which is quite obvious because the moment you start accessing non-commercial, which is easily available, the production rate also starts growing faster. Followed by which Atomic energy is also an important source of electric power. It has its own environmental advantage and likely to be a long and economical in the long run, all far as possible. So we do have certain atomic power stations in India which are working towards power generation, which are working towards creation of power and electricity. So this does become a very, very important sector. This does become a very, very crucial factor altogether. At present, nuclear energy accounts for only 2.4% of the total primary energy consumption against the global average of 13%. That is far too low. Why? Because if you start looking into the nuclear sector in India, only 2.4% is being consumed by the nuclear energy convention. That's what we have been able to drive. But we are not able to focus on it more for a longer energy. In compared to global average, where we are talking about 13%, India has got only 2.4%. So which means to say that India needs to focus on the nuclear energy development for the power generation in the long run. Moving forward, what are the challenges that are available in the power sector? The first challenge that you would start seeing here is that electricity that is generated by various power stations is not consumed entirely by the ultimate consumers. Why is that happening? That's because a part of the power station is concerned by its own auxiliaries that is being transmitting power, and that itself takes about 20 to 30% off. So the generator station that itself starts consuming 25 to 30%. So the output is only about 70% that is coming out from this electricity station. What we get in our houses, offices and factory is the net availability. But some of the challenges that we are going seeing today also is that the capacity matter. When India is looking for 100% capacity, hardly we are able to go till 50 or 60% only. Now, if you see here, to feed an annual economic growth of 7%, we need to see that the electricity has to add up almost up to 1 lakh megawatt. And that's what we are at present. But then India is only able to add 20,000 megawatts per year. Look at it. Only 1/5 of it is what we are able to add. We are looking for a 1 lakh megawatt addition every year so that we can go above 7% or 8% in terms of GDP. But the additional value that what India is doing or investing in the power sector is only 1/5 of the total capacity. So we need to really focus on investment in terms of power sector, and there needs to be a lot of private investment that needs to come up with the power sector altogether. Now, moving forward, if you also look here, the state electricity boards which distribute electricity incur losses that exceed over 500 billion rupees. That's quite a large amount that we are talking about. Why? Because they lack efficiency in terms of transmission. There are a lot of power thefts that have been happening, a lot of gap in terms of transmission and production, which is actually leaving in terms of this loss altogether. Many times we would have seen that we are getting a wrong electricity bill, or we are not getting the electricity bill on the correct time. There has been changes in the pricing. Sometimes we find that the consumer unit starts going up. So there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of running the electricity board statewide. So that's one of the reasons why we find that electricity is being lost and it is not being properly taken care of. Of course, some scholars also say that distribution of electricity to farmers is the main reason for the losses. Why? Because when we are supplying electricity, a major chunk of this electricity to the farmers at a free cost, the state government is not able to make back any money, which in turn adds up to the difficulty of the state electricity board. They're not able to generate revenue. So in turn, what they do, they add up that value to the consumer and the bill burden goes up again. Private power sector generators are yet to play the major role in this way because they are still looking in terms of developing it, in terms of making it. And we are also looking for foreign investors who can come to India and set up those large power sectors, which in turn can help to solve this electricity problem. The other factor that we also need to see here is that there is a general public unrest due to high power tariff. That's what we have been speaking about. Because of the high increase in the power rate and sector, the prolonged power cuts in different parts of the country, there has been a constant dip altogether. The thermal power plants, which are the mainstay of India's power sector, are facing a shortage. We are not able to match the supply and demand, and at some point of time, the electricity sector really need to step up so that we are able to meet the global challenges altogether. So this is where we see that somewhere down the lane, the power sector, though it is trying to help the manufacturing, though it is trying to push the GDP up, but still we are not able to come in terms of complete development exercise altogether. With this, I come to the conclusion for today's session. I hope and believe that this session was highly informative, educative, and useful. In the coming session, we will be learning more about the infrastructural development process. Until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today.